All right, thank you. Ruben, Ayana, and the entire ACMRS team for organizing this symposium. Before I get started, I have to say that this is a full circle moment for me. 6 years ago, I applied for a student travel grant and attended my very first conference as a graduate student right here in this room. Today, after 5 years of studying under Ayana, Ruben, Brandy, and Jonathan, I'm honored to have been invited to stand here and share my research with the same community that welcomed me 6 years ago. Thank you. Okay, so my talk today is titled, I'm Black and I'm Proud, What the Black Arts Movement Can Teach Shakespeare Theater Companies in a Post-2020 America. One trend that emerged as a result of the racial reckoning movement of 2020 was regional and national American Shakespeare theater companies starting to utilize their online platforms to host Shakespeareans of color in an attempt to promote an anti-racist Shakespeare. For example, the Public Theater created the hashtags Brave New Shakespeare and To Be Black, which was also the title of a video series on their YouTube page. The series urged viewers to, quote, listen as Black actors across the nation explored the truth and the painful reality of being Black in America with Shakespearean text. Likewise, regional Shakespeare theater companies such as the Folger Shakespeare Library hosted an online event in July of 2020 titled Critical Race Conversations, Cultivating an Anti-Racist Pedagogy to, quote, discuss methods of manifesting solidarity through pedagogical practice and demonstrate successful approaches to engaging in a meaningful, ongoing discussions with students about race, end quote. Additionally, Shakespeare Theater Company in Washington, D.C., another regional Shakespeare theater company, hosted Black Shakespearean scholars and theater practitioners in 2020 to explore the historical struggles of Black Shakespearean actors being accepted in the classical community. Now, while these multimodal, easily accessible events were convenient during the COVID-19 lockdown restrictions and timely during a moment when the global society was seemingly interested in addressing structural and institutional anti-Black racism, I contend that all of these platforms were largely designed to teach majority white audiences how to become anti-racist users of Shakespeare. With the rise of white rage retaliating against the performance arts industry increasing progress in 2020, I argue that in addition to promoting anti-racism on and off the stage, American Shakespeare theater companies also need to reflect on and even consult Black artists from the past who learned to love the art and language of Shakespeare amid an anti-racist media campaign that, like today, was determined to characterize the rise of Black power movements as radically violent, threatening, and disruptive to American society. If Shakespeare or American Shakespeare theater companies want to continue upholding their 2020 public pledges to create a safer and more equitable theater space for theater practitioners of color, then they must resist these tactics or risk repeating them. Since 2020, users of color have spoken publicly about feeling as if American Shakespeare theater companies are virtue signaling by advancing an anti-racist Shakespeare online and on the stage while struggling to do similar work beyond the stage, such as within their hiring practices. Thus, this paper reflects on how 20th century Black American artists transformed Shakespeare by asserting themselves in a literary and performance tradition that had been reserved for an exclusively white American culture. Specifically, my research focuses on the Black arts movement from 1960 to 1980, which was a brief moment in American history when Black artists largely became interested in decentering whiteness by creating their own version of performance art, liberated from the white gaze. By reflecting on a few Black artists during this time who were determined to love Shakespeare while simultaneously creating their own Afrocentric version of the poet and playwright, this paper illustrates how and why American Shakespeare theater companies must begin to celebrate the joy of Black art beyond only using our experiences as a teachable moment for white audiences. I define love in this context by what author and cultural critic Bell Hooks refers to as a love ethic. According to Hooks, a love ethic, quote, presupposes that everyone has the right to be free, to live fully and well, and that, quote, in order to bring a love ethic to every dimension of our lives, our society would need to embrace change, end quote. One of these social changes, according to Hooks, includes understanding love as being inextricably connected to justice. Hooks writes that, quote, there can be no love without justice, end quote. She continues, asserting that love as justice means adopting the understanding that people, quote, are not property, they have rights, and we respect and uphold those rights, end quote. Hooks also explains that love is a healing power for past trauma. She writes in the introduction to her book, All About Love, New Visions, that, quote, only love can heal the wounds of the past. Thus, I will reflect on the Black arts movement as a moment in performance history that was dedicated to defining a community's love ethic through the process of justice and healing. For members of the movement, this process required decentering whiteness while embracing a performance art that attested to our collective experiences. Drawing on Hooks's love ethic, I contend that the future of performing Shakespeare in a post-2020 America must include justice and healing as foundational principles that are required for fostering anti-racist theater spaces. The Black arts movement occurred at a critical moment in 20th century American history, and it operated in tandem with the Black Power movement. In fact, one of the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense's co-founders was an actor named Bobby Scale, who once worked for Ed Bullen's Black Arts West Theater Company. Bullens was a playwright and director who was also a leading theater voice in the Black arts movement. According to Mike Sales' book chapter titled The Black Arts Movement, Performance, Neo-Orality, and the Destruction of the White Thing, quote, both the Black Power and the Black arts movements devised Black nationalist strategies to effectively respond to the complications of race politics by the peculiar characteristics of the American political scene in the 1960s. A scene dominated by a tendentiously racist mass media which seemed intent on transforming social and civil turmoil of the era into a multimedia spectacle, end quote. Larry Neal, who was a writer, poet, and academic, wrote in an Ebony magazine article titled Any Day Now, Black Art and Black Liberation, that the Black arts movement sought to, quote, link in a highly conscious manner art and politics in order to assist in the liberation of Black people. While the movement was often displayed as hyper-masculine, one of the key events that merged the interests of Black activists and Black artists was the CIA-sanctioned assassination of Patrice Lumumba, the first prime minister of the then recently independent Republic of the Congo, on January 17, 1961. Miriam Kaba's graphic novel titled A Riot at the United Nations explains that after hearing an impassioned speech by Malcolm X about white violence and Black complicity, two Black women artists, poet Maya Angelou and novelist Rosa Guy, quote, rallied the Cultural Association for Women of African Heritage, which they had recently helped found, to stage a protest during the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, Adai Stevenson's speech at the UN. Saba writes that the two women, quote, urged the crowd to join them at the United Nations in protest of Lumumba's murder. While this event is largely overlooked today, Saba writes that in addition to emphasizing the significance of Black women actors or activists and Black movements, it also, quote, demonstrated the power of connecting international and domestic anti-racist struggles and foreshadowed international Black movements against South African apartheid, end quote. Following this act of organizing, Black writers, poets, academics, actors, and activists became leading figures in creating what we now know as the Black arts movement. While the Black Panthers Party's movement and the Black arts movement were largely parallel, there were also significant differences between the two movements. Perhaps chief among them were their strategies for using mainstream white media to advance their causes. Sale writes, quotes, while the Panthers attempted to seduce and exploit the media and wealthy liberals by way of outrageous, blatant displays of hypermasculine Blackness, the Black arts movement sought to evade white media, tolerant liberal wealth, and Euro-American aesthetic traditions by taking their revolutionary Afrocentric cultural program to historically Black American colleges and urban, geographically distinct Black American communities, end quote. The desire for self-determination led to the opening of Black theaters, such as Amira Baraka's Black Arts Repertory Theater and School, or BARTS, Black plays, such as Sonia Sanchez's The Bronx is Next, and for some, a reimagination of Western classics, including Shakespeare's plays. One example of this trend is Elizabeth, or Liz White's 1961 adaptation of Shakespeare's Othello. To my knowledge, this adaptation has not been explored in prior scholarship. While the nonprofit organization Southside Projections in Chicago, Illinois, publicly screened the production in 2021, little to no additional research has been published on White's play. While it is unclear if Liz White herself was an active participant in the Black arts movement, her adaptation of Shakespeare's most famous so-called race play certainly reflected how Black artists during the time were beginning to re-envision their own version of the Bard. Set in Martha's Vineyard in the early 1960s, White's adaptation featured an all-Black cast and explored ongoing inter-community tensions such as colorism, nativism, and Black cross-cultural conflicts. Unlike Shakespeare's play, where Othello is an outsider because he is the only Moor among the other white characters in the play, White's Othello is an outsider because he is presumably the only continental African character in the play with clear physical and cultural differences from his Black counterparts. This directorial decision illuminated the ongoing tensions within the African diaspora that artists during the Black arts movement were interested in confronting. Perhaps the most significant concept underscored in White's production is the playwright's ability to decenter whiteness by creating a Shakespearean adaptation that is centered on the experiences of Black people living in Black communities. Honey Crawford, who moderated a conversation after the 2019 screening of White's Othello, stated that she felt as if White was, quote, operating under an African logic. For Crawford, the cast, quote, aren't black folks living in a white world, just a black world where colorism exists and the audience is at least made to see division within black folks through our own logic, end quote. I argue that this is the most significant development in the uncovering of White's adaptation. For several years now, prominent scholars, including the great Ayanna Thompson herself, have argued with good reason that Othello is one of Shakespeare's toxic plays, despite many theater companies' desires and intentions to present it as anti-racist. Although White's production was created in a different historical moment, its ability to use Shakespeare's language and narrative building to share a story about tensions within black communities through the lens of black actors is precisely how we should perform Othello in a post-2020 America. Revisiting White's production allows scholars and theater practitioners the ability to view Shakespeare's play as a community in crisis rather than an isolating anti-black production that furthers the racist stereotype of black men as violent monsters who must be punished for causing problems in white communities. I assert that because of the Black arts movement's desire to find love in Western literature through justice and healing, White's labor of love with this adaptation provides American Shakespeare theater companies a new way of performing the controversial play in a post-George Floyd America. White's production teaches us how we can interrogate violence, mistrust, and surveillance without centering whiteness and succumbing to anti-blackness. Over the course of 4 summers, from 1962 to 1966, White directed a film version of her adaptation. The film, like many black films during the time, was not screened until nearly 20 years later in 1980 on the campus of Howard University. Since 2010, the film has been housed at Indiana University's Black Film Center and Archive, which noted the significance of White's Othello as, quote, the first film version to star a black man and the only Shakespearean film directed by a black woman. In a post-2020 America, American Shakespeare theater companies should not only begin to recover lost art from black Shakespearean artists such as Liz White, but they should also reflect on how these artists created revolutionary ways of performing Shakespeare for the purposes of self-determination and cultural restoration. Another key component of the Black arts movement was the quest for black artists to define their love for the arts while also challenging the white supremacist idea that theater is a space that belongs exclusively to whiteness. Artists within the movement's approach to this pursuit, however, varied, and one was often in conflict with the other. The first approach was for artists to express their love for and devotion to the Black arts movement by evading Western literature and performance arts completely, including Shakespeare's work. For example, in the article, The So-Called Western Avant-Garde Drama, Ed Bullins critiques contemporary Western theater, writing that, quote, it is the white man's vision of reality that is most identifiable in his drama, and black dramatists are not heir to that type of madness, end quote. Bullins also adds that, quote, for the white man, there are no stories, or plots, or characters, and somehow by the time they filter down to present-day theater, there are no really new ideas in his culture, end quote. For several black artists during this time, the only way to truly revolutionize Western theater was not to reimagine existing existing Western art, but to seek a, quote, post-American form of Black theater. Bullins asserts that this is the type of Black art that is, quote, like a dagger pointed at the vitals of America. And through the rips, we can enter a new epoch. The other approach, however, was for Black artists to express their love for the Black or African diaspora and Western artists such as Shakespeare by avowing to create a version of Western theater that spoke to and was representative of their collective experiences. For example, in 1965, James Baldwin wrote an essay aptly titled, "Why I Stopped Hating Shakespeare." Baldwin explains how during his most anti-English days, he, quote, condemned Shakespeare as a chauvinist. Like several other Black activists during this time, Baldwin also condemned Shakespeare as, quote, one of the authors and architects of his oppression, end quote. Over the course of time, after hearing and resonating with the words of Cassius and Shakespeare's Julius Caesar, Baldwin explains that he started to quarrel with the idea that, quote, perhaps Shakespeare's language was not Baldwin's own because he had never attempted to use it and had only learned to imitate it, end quote. Unlike Bullins, who believed Black art could only thrive if it was separate from white Western art, Baldwin came to believe that his relationship to Shakespeare's language, quote, revealed itself as nothing less than Baldwin's relationship to himself and his past. Thus, Baldwin's essay represents the group of Black artists during the Black arts movement who viewed Shakespeare's language as a love ethic that, despite their vastly different lived experiences, understood that what was happening to others around them was also happening to them. While the Black arts movement is a crucial moment in Black literary and performance history that we often look back on with pride, it is important to note that the reason the movement is a historical one is because it came to an end. In fact, according to Henry Louis Gates Jr.'s 1994 Time magazine article titled "Black Creativity on the Cutting Edge," the Black arts movement was the shortest-lived Black Renaissance movement in comparison to the New Negro literary movement and the Harlem Renaissance movement in the early 20th century. One reason the movement was short-lived was because many of its artists did not value the preservation of texts and objects, since the real value of art, according to Larry Neal, quote, was to be found in the performances, artists, and communities that surrounded the object and text, end quote. The movement held true to Gil Scott-Heron's 1971 words that, quote, the revolution would not be televised, end quote. Other conditions that led to the ending of the Black arts movement were economic fallouts, infighting, and an ongoing racist campaign of governmental intervention that started at the movement's inception. In 1979, towards the end of the movement, conservative think tank group, the Heritage Foundation, publicized their demands for the incoming Reagan administration in a document titled Mandate for Leadership. The purpose of the document was to assist the transition to a new administration in the event that a conservative president were elected in 1980, end quote. As it relates to the national endowments for the humanities and the arts, the group's short-term goal was to eliminate any policies that resulted in racial diversity. They stated that an immediate administrative act, quote, should be to rescind guidelines for racial or ethnic quotas applied to the grant review and evaluation process, end quote. The Reagan administration also sought to cut the NEH and NEA's funding by 50% beginning in fiscal year 1982. Ultimately, Congress reduced funding for the NEH by approximately $73.8 million and the NEA by approximately $71.2 million. As a result of these funding cuts, less financial assistance was provided for alternative and nonprofit art spaces, many of which were critical resources for Black artists and theater companies. The conditions that led to the discontinuation of this Black liberation movement are eerily similar to what we are facing today. For example, the Trump administration is currently fulfilling much of its Project 2025 agenda that was published prior to the 2024 presidential election and was written by the Heritage Foundation, the same conservative group that published the 1980 Mandate for Leadership. Additionally, like Nixon and J. Edgar Hoover's 20th century counterintelligence program that infiltrated the Black arts movement, the current administration is planning to investigate and target left-wing groups' tax exemption status under the guise of fomenting left-wing political violence. As we reflect on Black Shakespearean performance and performance arts from the Black arts movement and contemplate what love as justice and healing look like today, I submit that we must also recognize this historical moment as a cautionary tale about how institutional failure to truly promote anti-racism by implementing cultural awareness practices both on and off the stage can quietly lead to the dismantling of artistic progress to which several American Shakespeare theater companies pledged in 2020. Thank you.